Hello there, my name is Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Well, my scraps are getting out of control again, but today we're going to focus on triangles. I recently finished about 27 quilts and I made a lot of binding. I have tons and tons of little triangles left over from making binding and also making some half square triangles. I want to share just a few ideas I came up with on things you can do with those little scrap triangles. For this first project, I'm using a leftover 2.5 inch white strip. I'm going to be making half square triangles just by putting my little triangles on top of this 2.5 inch strip. Since most of these triangles came from 2.5 inch strips of binding, they fit very nicely on this 2.5 inch strip. These little triangles are a lot smaller than what I like to work with, but I didn't want to waste the fabric, so I thought I'd just go ahead and make as many of these as I could. After sewing quite a few of these, I went ahead and cut them apart and pressed them flat. Next, it was time to trim all these little tiny blocks, and I'm using that diagonal line on my ruler, trimming off the right side and the top side, and then I will flip this little tiny block around, and I'm going to be trimming the other two sides. It depends on the size of your triangles, but I am trimming these little squares down to 1 3/4 inches. Now, once you make your HSTs, you can use them to make any kind of block or any kind of quilt. Once I decided on my little tiny block layout, I took 2 little squares and stitched them together, and I continued on until I had my 4 rows complete. Then I sewed the 4 rows together. I think it would be fun to create these tiny half square triangles and then save them up, maybe put them together in little blocks, and then eventually you would have a huge quilt made out of tiny, tiny, tiny little squares. For this block, I went ahead and stitched on some 2.5 inch white strips around for a border of this block. I think it's going to fit nicely into an orphan project. Well, let's look at idea number 2. Since I did finish all those quilts, I also have a lot of strips left over. I'm going to use my triangle just as the base of a mountain or a hill or whatever you want to call it. I'm just starting out sewing strips alongside my triangle, and then I'm adding a few more strips, and then as I get to the corners, I could have used other triangles. This was certainly the easiest thing I did with my triangles, and I think if I finish a bunch of quilts, the ratio of triangles to strips would be just about perfect for this kind of a block. Well, my third idea that I wanted to try out. I'm going to do some applique a couple of different ways, one with facing and one without facing. So we're starting out here, and all I'm doing is pressing down my seam allowance so that I don't have to worry about this. I'm just going to be top stitching this little triangle. But before I do that, I'll have all my seam allowances folded over and pressed nice and flat. I'm going to take this triangle and place it on a 5-inch square. I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to do some decorative stitching around all 3 sides. I'll be right back. Now, if you were using a real, like a muslin foundation, the bunching that you see here is not going to matter, because eventually you would add more and more pieces and then you would trim it to your block size. I'm going to do almost the exact same thing I just did, but instead of folding under and pressing my seam allowances and top stitching, I am going to use a stick-on adhesive that's designed for applique. Once I've got my triangles all lined up in a square shape, I'm going to cut out a piece of my adhesive bonding, and I'm going to cut that out into a square shape. Now, since I'm using this wool pressing mat, I need to really trim this off a little bit more. I don't want any of that to get on my pressing mat. I'm going to press this bumpy side down to the back of my fabric triangles. Now I'm going to peel off that backing paper, which is going to expose the double side of the adhesive. I'm going to cut apart these triangles and I'm going to place them where I want them, and then I will press, then I will top stitch. Now for this sample, I am not measuring these triangles. If I was going to make a finished project, I would be using squares and measuring them exactly so that all my quilt blocks would be the same. But for this little project, it's not a big deal. I'm just testing this out to see if I like it. So next I'm using my iron to press this adhesive so it stays in place, and then I will be taking all 4 of these squares to the sewing machine, and I'm going to try out some different stitches on my sewing machine, and once I've done that, I'll bring them back to show you. All right, the first square I'm showing you is just a simple blanket stitch. Now this one came out very nicely. It did not make the fabric bunch up or anything. It just worked very, very well. Next, I'm showing you this zigzag stitch. I'm not sure if I could have done this differently, but it did seem to make my fabric bunch up a little bit. Now this next stitch is almost like an asterisk. It seemed to work pretty well. There wasn't much bunching, and I actually do like the way it works. It looks like little stars. Now this stitch on the left, that was the worst for bunching. That did not work at all for the edge of the applique item. However, on the right hand side triangle, I used a different stitch that would not bunch around the outside edge of the applique, and then I used that stitch as a secondary pattern on the interior, and that way I did not get any bunching. I really like this one the best of all. It's very interesting to have that double layer of stitching. I did go ahead and stitch these 4 little squares together just to see if it was something I would want to pursue in the future. I will have to give it a little more thought before I go forward with a formal project, but this will be a nice little addition to my orphan block pile. I hope you found some of these ideas useful. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I do hope to see you back again real soon.